All right. Hi. Thanks, Steve. That was brilliant. And I wanted to draw everyone's attention to the brilliant translation that Steve has made of Foucault's lectures from 1981 called Wrongdoing, Truth-Telling. And they were given in 1981. They're about the function of a vowel in justice. And they will be coming out next week in English. So keep your...
Edited by Bernard Harcourt.
All right. Okay, so I think Steve brilliantly outlined many of the pieces, of the larger pieces of the Foucault work on the state. And what I'd like to try and do is highlight a particular political moment, a particular engagement with the notion of the state, which I think was one of Foucault's most direct engagements with the state, which occurred in 1973 in his lectures, which not surprisingly are called The Punitive Society, right? Punitive Society, which have just been released in French and will be forthcoming in English. They haven't been translated yet. Now I say not surprisingly because the use of the term society is very important here. It shouldn't come as a surprise that Foucault directed the title of those lectures toward the notion of society in the context of a direct engagement with state power. Now, at the time in 1972-73, Foucault was trying to understand and resist what he perceived as a repressive state. So France in the post-68 period was marked by a French government repression of leftist political parties, the shutting down of political parties, the arrest and incarceration of a number of Maoist militant students, crackdown on social movements, etc. It was for the period an extremely repressive moment in French history. Now, of course, there have been many repressive moments in French history, so it's hard to compare to others. But it was perceived at the time as being an exceptionally repressive period. Now, the year before, in his lectures on penal theories and institutions, 1972, Foucault had directly taken on the state and state repression, focusing those lectures on the militarized repression of the Nu-Pieds movement in Normandy in 1649. Those lectures are actually remarkable, deeply historical. Though they haven't come out yet, but they will be coming out in a year. But what's clear is that the first 7 lectures are pure historical narrative of the Nu-Pieds movement and its repression. Right? And what he was trying to understand was the state repression at that moment and how it was operating exactly. But there was, in some sense, it was a reaction to that and to the focus on the state and state repression that he would turn to in 1973 in his lectures on the disciplinary society. It's called the Punitive Society, but it's the Disciplinary Society. Taking on directly, but silently, as he always did, writing against Althusser's notion of state apparatuses and of ideological state apparatuses, writing against Hobbes' idea that the sovereign grows out of a war of all against all, is preceded by that natural state of war and succeeded by civil war, against Marx's notion of a state overseeing class warfare, and against E.P. Thompson's implicit or projected idea of the state as constituted in part by the repression of seditious mobs and their moral economies. I developed this at length in the Situation du Cours that I've distributed. Unfortunately, it hasn't been translated yet, and if anybody wants it, I can get it to them as well, but I don't have a translation of it yet. And I traced the movement at this point to a sentence that Foucault wrote to Daniel Defer in a personal letter in December 1972, just before he would start the lectures in 73, where he said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start analyzing relations of power on the basis of the most disparaged of all wars, neither Hobbes, nor Clausewitz, nor class war, but rather civil war. Now, Foucault, of course, would never mention directly Althusser, but it is clear that he was aiming at Althusser and the notion of state apparatuses directly. There are a couple of passages which are striking in that sense. This is a passage where, this is on page 233, it's on the 28th of March, 1973. What he's saying is, so what he says in this beginning, so I don't believe that power can be described adequately as something that would be localized in state apparatuses. It might even be insufficient to say that state apparatuses are the location of a struggle, interior or exterior. It seems to me instead that l'appareil d'État, so the state apparatus, is a concentrated form or a support structure of a system of power that goes much beyond it and far deeper, right? So, in practical terms, and of course this was his take on 68, right? Neither the destruction nor the control of state apparatuses would be sufficient to transform any or to make disappear any particular forms of power, and especially forms of power within which it functions. Okay, so this idea here is that a direct sense of the calling for a deeper analysis of the kind I think that we've heard over the past 2 days, really, right? It's embedding our understanding of the state within a deeper and wider space that he was calling society in terms of la société punitive, but that we have been kind of exploring. And also a deeper analysis of what makes these structures of power tolerable, okay? Because that was the focus. I mean, that was his prime question in 72, 73, post-May 68, was how did these forms of power appear tolerable, become tolerable? And so how to study these embedded structures, right? And to the concept of Althusser's appareil d'État, Foucault would oppose a far more fluid concept. And of course, he is studying the 19th century at this point, and one of the examples that he uses the most is the sequestration of private initiative, so the factory convents and the way that they operated, particularly the factory convent at Julius, which was a particular place where they made cloth. And of course it was the convent, the penitentiary, the kind of space that we are familiar with from Discipline and Punish, and which had the kind of timetables. In fact, the timetable that ends up at the beginning of Discipline and Punish was born, in a sense, from the timetables at Julius. And then, of course, he moved to the other institutions that had similar timetables. But these were spaces, right, that depended so much on the state, but that were private, that regulated every aspect of its workers' lives, their sexuality, their recreation, their spirituality, their habits, their vices, their moral upbringing, etc., who they came into contact, what gender of people they could work with on the factory floor, etc. So it was this minute control of every aspect of their lives, private enterprise that meshed with, benefited from, resisted, and manipulated state initiatives, such as, for instance, laws requiring workers to carry their livret, the annotated work registrations, with them at all times, so that they could be policed properly, because the livret was a state apparatus, but it would be policed by all kinds of different entities, all kinds of practices and institutions. Of course, the police, but also the shop foreman, of course, the bartender, the night attendant in the dorm, right, who would use these vehicles to then exercise their own policing mechanisms. The laws regarding mandatory livret would multiply based from the worker's registration to the savings account, each facilitating the employer's hold on his workers, allowing him to annotate and comment for future employers through a whole system of what Foucault called micro-punishments that lead the worker through the revolving doors of employment, of debt, of the penal system, etc. So this is how he would describe it, and I think there's a fascinating, this is like immediate right to Sarah and Damon's paper right here, actually. So what he says is, you have to notice that most of these establishments, and so he's talking about these convent factories, most of these establishments take the state-like structure as its model, right? They are like little states. That are functioning inside the state. They always rely on state apparatus for whole systems of kind of back and forth and reciprocities. this is actually a direct quote from your paper, practically, right? The factory couldn't function without this structure of factories, without the police and the army, right? All of these establishments that, in some sense, were related to the state, that relèvent de l'État, whether directly or not, always throws back to these kinds of apparatuses. And so basically, rather than talking about appareil d'État, right, we should think instead of kind of multiplier relays of power within a society where the state-like structure remains the functional condition of these institutions. Okay. Now, of course, this is a more fluid concept of these various institutions and the way they relate being caught in state-like knots. So a multi-dimensional space of practices, institutions, and within relations of power complexly tied up within these state knots and themselves representing a state knot. Now, is this a theory of the state? No, it's not a theory of the state. Is it a history of the state? No, it isn't either a history of the state. And the question, of course, what is it? And I would say it's a method that is captured, of course, so well by Foucault's last sentence in the last footnote of Discipline and Punish, right, where he says, "I interrupt this book that must serve as an arrière-plan historique," so a historic background, essentially. Right? This will serve as a historic background to diverse studies on the power of normalization and the formation of knowledge in modern society. Right? A historical backdrop, perhaps, would be the word that he used in 75, and that might be appropriate here. Now, of course, no wonder that Foucault would then turn to the study of forms of neoliberal governmentality a few years later, entirely in the vein of these fluid conceptions of multidimensional practices, institutions, and relations of power complexly tied up within state-like knots. And so he would focus on rationalities of human capital, developed in part by Gary Becker. And I think I actually should stop here for a moment to mourn Gary Becker, who was actually a remarkable thinker, incredibly open. And we were actually going to have our third session of the Foucault, Ewald, Becker seminar yesterday at noon, because we've been trying to get Becker and Foucault in conversation. We've had two of them, which were marvelous 2 years and 1 year ago. And we were actually going to have the third one on the third lecture yesterday at noon. But as you know, he unfortunately passed away, so tragic loss for us all. But I would say that there's no surprise, given this background, that Foucault would explore neoliberalism. And in fact, we could think of neoliberalism as the perfect exemplar of fluid, knotted, state-like intersections. Now, I think it would be appropriate at this juncture to explore the notion that Foucault develops in 73 on illegalisms, as an illustration of the fluidity between the way in which different constituencies relate to the law and the notion of an illegality, negotiating that space, right? The idea, in essence, is that there's social and political agonism that is constantly negotiating the boundaries of the illegal and the legal and calling into play the sanction of the state, right? Using illegality of the state, going to the knot of the state as a way to kind of to transform relations of power, right? I would elaborate that. I elaborate this in the course context. So let me leave it at that. Let's throw out an idea. We can talk about it if necessary. But instead, let me just turn to a recent anecdote regarding these knots of state-like power. Josh Begley is a graduate student at NYU. I think he actually just defended his thesis. So a a former graduate student, who's been trying to raise our awareness about the US government's use of drones and the civilian casualties associated with drone strikes. And his idea, in essence, oh, I'm terribly sorry. I forgot this slide. At the bottom of that passage, I'm sorry. At the bottom of that passage, there's a passage in the manuscript itself that he didn't say, but that I think forms the basis of this, of a perfect definition here. And he wrote it. He didn't say it, although I did reproduce it. But it's not a state apparatus. It's an apparatus enmeshed in the state-like knot, an intrastate-like system, right? I apologize. Let me get back to Josh Begley. So Josh Begley is a graduate student. What he's trying to do is he's trying to kind of make drones more noticeable. They've been hidden. It's a hidden part of the state. And what he had this idea of creating an app which would, every time there's a drone strike and victims, that it would ping you so that, you know, when you're playing with your Facebook or something, you, like, reality should encroach on our lives a little bit more. And so he developed an app for iPhones in the summer of 2012 called Drones Plus that would provide instant updated information about drone strikes and casualties. And basically, the way that it would work, so the Bureau of Investigative Journalism has been doing remarkable work in England, documenting all of the drone strikes and all of the victims that there have been. There have been more than 400 drone strikes, probably about 480 something, with more than 4,000 casualties. And actually, to get a sense of this, to get a sense of what it would like to be pinged, there's one particular graphic representation of the
and to feel the way that every child should sit and listen, sit and listen. Went to school and I was very nervous. No one knew me, no one knew me. Hello teacher, tell me what's my lesson. Look right through me, look right through me. And I find it kind of funny, I find it kind of sad. The dreams in which I'm dying are the best I've ever had. I find it hard to tell you, I find it hard to take. People run in circles, it's a very, very mad world. Mad world. Enlarging your world. Mad world.
What Josh Begley is trying to do essentially is to allow that rain to kind of come into our lives rather than staying in Pakistan and elsewhere. Now, interestingly, Begley created this app called Drones Plus, and he submitted it to Apple on July 10th, 2012. But Apple refused to offer drones on its app store, basically saying that the app was not useful or entertaining enough, and it did not appeal to a broad enough audience. So he rejiggered it, and he reapplied a second time in August 2012, and he got rejected again because, according to Mashable, the app used Google Maps images without the associated Google branding. So Begley then reapplied for a third time in August 27, 2012, and the third application was also denied, and Apple stated that we found that your app contains content that many audience would find objectionable, which is not in compliance with the App Store review guidelines. So he then went on to create this thing called Drone Stream, which you saw in part, to give this real time, and he's created a Twitter account and is trying to kind of Twitter every single drone strike. 1 year later, he tries again. This time he names the app DroneStream and submits it twice, September 10th, September 17th. That didn't work out either. It got rejected both times. At that point, he got a phone call from an employee at Apple, and who basically said, look, if it's going to be that specific, it's not going to get approved. What you need to do is broaden your topic a little bit. So what Begley decided to do in 2014 was to create an empty app. It didn't have anything on it, called Ephemeral, and he submitted it to Apple, and it was immediately accepted. It was quietly accepted, as he said. So on January 22nd, he then created this other thing called Metadata Plus, which promised, quote, real-time updates on national security, and that one also went through 6 days later without any objections, and so the app is now functional, and it's called Metadata Plus. Now, these are then perhaps knots of state-like power that comprise the space that we are trying to understand. I'll make 3 points in conclusion quickly, because I think my time is up. First, it's state-like in very important ways. You'll recall, of course, that the US government put a stop to media coverage of incoming deceased soldiers during the war in 1991, a policy that lasted for 18 years, prohibiting news coverage of the return of US soldiers killed in war. The Obama administration lifted that in December 2009, allowing families to decide. Now, there's a real sense in which, of course, state-like is what the Apple is doing in its kind of rejection of this, right? This isn't palatable in a way, right? And Apple, in some sense, takes on this state-like function of deciding kind of what is palatable, what is not palatable, what should remain hidden, and what should not remain hidden. In a second sense, it's also about making these exercises of power entirely tolerable, right? I think that if we were, in fact, pinged for every death associated with a drone, particularly children and civilians, maybe we would feel differently. I mean, it's an act in the same way that the state is acting to make its exercise of power tolerable. And finally, it's made tolerable by these knotty relationships, naughty and naughty, relationships between the state and these enterprises that so deeply control our lives. Okay, so let me stop there, and we've got, I believe, a few minutes for discussion.
Great, thank you.